Good evening, everyone. First, we extend our great thanks to the Society for hosting this memorable event. And we're very thrilled to be here among such distinguished guests and members. And before I go on, I want to say that, besides the prize itself, it's a unique prize in itself to have the honor to speak to all the great and interesting minds in this room. Both last night for those that were here and throughout this evening. For a little background on Thinking West, we started this project a few years ago when we discovered a set of books. So far from something on the internet, which we migrated to soon after. But the set of books was called The Great Books of the Western World. It's a unique book set published in the 1950s that introduced readers to the vast richness of the Western canon. And this inspired us by its editor's vision for a dedicated study of the great ideas of the past. Thus, Thinking West was born as a humble blog to both encourage those interested in the great books and others who haven't heard of these great works to reach back to the great books, and as a creative outlook for our thoughts on the culture. But this evolved a little bit over time. We stepped into the world of X and YouTube and found that our mission expanded beyond the great books themselves to rekindling interest in the minds and ideas that built the West. And that message, we have found, has resonated with many around the world. We thank the Society for recognizing our work, and it's been a pleasure getting to know many of you in the room today. We're honored to receive the Oswald Spengler Prize alongside culture critic, whose work has greatly influenced our own. To be counted among the cohort of previous winners is truly humbling. But next, we'd like to offer some brief reflections on kind of the state of Western education more broadly, the classical tradition, and the role of gratitude specifically at the societal level. So Spengler's work reminds us that understanding our present and future requires a profound appreciation of history and culture, an appreciation that is unfortunately lacking in the current zeitgeist. Therefore, it's our mission to bring about a new appreciation of Western tradition, further to revive a gratitude for its fundamental cultural institutions. So some might interpret those who think we live in challenging times, and we certainly do, and write them off as great pessimists. But they're not necessarily pessimists per se. They are critics of the times, but this criticism itself implies a sort of hopefulness for the future, because they understand that our current state of affairs may not be the pinnacle in our society. Critics of society's path are really tapping into the thought of 20th century writer G.K. Chesterton. So he wrote about this necessary love-hate relationship that one must have with their world. In his great work, Orthodoxy, he writes, "Can he hate it enough to change it, and yet love it enough to think it worth changing? Can he look up at its colossal good without once feeling acquiescence? Can he look up at its colossal evil without once feeling despair?" So we must recognize the imperfections of Western civilization as it stands today, while still valuing it enough to work for its betterment. On the other hand, there are many movements today that seek to change the culture without loving the core Western ideals. Then there are those who may love their culture but relegate their fascination to passive commentary. And it's only by holding these dichotomous feelings toward the culture, this love and hate relationship of Chesterton, that we find the genuine motivation to realign its institutions with its values. Gratitude lies at the root of any concern for one's culture. One must be grateful to appreciate the things passed down to them by their ancestors. As the late Sir Roger Scruton pointed out, we inherit our past, and now culture lies in our trusteeship. In the political sphere, we see the effects of movements that have no gratitude. They aim only to remake society without heeding the whys behind the institutions they seek to remake. A society that is not grateful for its past eventually eats itself. Gratitude is a central value of the West. This begs the question, of course, what are we grateful for? What does constitute the West that we seek to better? And the answer will vary depending on who is asked. According to historian Christopher Dawson, Western civilization is rooted in three elements. The first is very familiar to most, the Judeo-Christian values. They're primary. Second, there's the Greek philosophical and scientific spirit, But thirdly, and perhaps less acknowledged, is the classical tradition, the great conversation across history. And it's in this third element that we find the gratitude that we must hold in the West. We would not constantly look back to the great thinkers of our past if we did not believe them worth listening to. And now our modern era offers universal access through things like the internet to these great thinkers. And through this technology, though it has its many vices, all the great libraries of the world have essentially been opened to everyone. And now Adam will continue on how this classical tradition has evolved today.
So this classical tradition that Christian has introduced to us has now entered the modern internet-connected world in a new way, that of democratized media. Social media now enables the great conversation to happen in real time across the globe. The classical tradition has moved from the lofty pages of treatises and novels to social media and video. Hence the success of those here today, ourselves and Culture Critic, many other X accounts, YouTube channels, and podcasts. They're now seeing the growth that comes when an information-hungry culture finds a new printing press. But classical tradition cannot survive in a culture that does not first respect tradition, in a culture that is not grateful. Today, the past is viewed as something to get away from rather than something to learn from. Even the great institutions tasked with upholding the core principles of our culture often not only fail, but actively subvert their own founding ideals. For example, schools and universities, which host many of the world's great libraries, once acted as stewards of the great Western canon. Now these great works are often relegated to the margins. Homer, Dante, and Milton have become foreign to the average, quote-unquote, educated student. So the question remains, what can we do in a culture that fails to appreciate the cornerstones of our civilization? I'm reminded of the 6th century monk named Cassiodorus, who occupied a pivotal time in history during the decline of the Western Roman Empire. At a time when the future seemed uncertain, Cassiodorus endeavored to create a system of education that would ensure future generations had access to many of the Greek and Roman texts that he had inherited. He insisted that the great texts of the past were the best teachers, laying the foundations of classical education during the medieval age, and that classical tradition has continued on and was really only abandoned until recently. Additionally, Cassiodorus understood the practical demands of his mission. It was not enough to merely preach the worthiness of the great works. It was essential to make these works tangibly widespread. Thus, he instituted a regimen for the mass production of texts, ensuring the education of future generations and the survival of many of the great works of antiquity. Our task is not unlike Cassiodorus's. We too believe the minds of the past are instrumental to forming the minds of the future. Just as he sought to safeguard the best of Roman culture during chaotic times, so too must we strive to protect the riches of our heritage from forces intent on replacing gratitude with resentment. Though today the great works of the world are in no danger of being lost, they are in danger of losing their influence. The challenge now in our digital age is to rekindle an interest in the great works and instill a gratitude to our past. So Christian and I, with Thinking West, have aimed to meet this challenge through our efforts on social media and YouTube by introducing the common man to the great books, ideas, and figures of the Western tradition. We believe the goals of the Spengler Society align with our own and that a profound appreciation of our past will better guide us through the turbulent times ahead. So once again, we appreciate your time today, and we thank you so much for this profound honor. Thank you.